The operating room smelled of antiseptic and quiet urgency, the kind of silence that only existed where lives were balanced on decisions measured in seconds. Dr. Elijah Carter stood scrubbed in, hands lifted, eyes steady on the monitors. Years of training had taught him how to keep his breathing slow when everything around him pulsed with pressure. The patient on the table, an older white man named Richard Holloway, was already prepped, chest exposed, surgical lights flooding the room with a harsh, unforgiving glow. Elijah had reviewed the chart twice that morning. Severe aortic stenosis. Complications. A narrow margin for error. It was the kind of case that separated good surgeons from great ones. Elijah knew the risks, knew the anatomy, knew the plan. He had performed variations of this surgery dozens of times, but this one mattered more than most. Not because of prestige, but because he had noticed something others hadn't during pre-op. Subtle indicators in the imaging that suggested an atypical calcification pattern. If he was right, the standard approach could turn deadly. "Vitals steady," the anesthesiologist said calmly. Elijah nodded. "Scalpel." The instrument was placed in his palm. His grip was firm, precise. The first incision was clean. The team moved with practiced coordination, nurses anticipating needs, the scrub tech tracking every movement. For a few minutes, it was exactly how surgery was supposed to be: focused, quiet, professional. Then the door opened. The sound cut through the room like a dropped tray. Everyone glanced up. Dr. Harold Whitman stepped inside, his presence immediate and heavy. He was the head of cardiothoracic surgery, white, silver-haired, and widely known for his temper as much as his resume. His eyes flicked from the monitors to Elijah, lingering there a second longer than necessary. "What's going on here?" Whitman asked, voice flat but edged. Elijah didn't look away from the surgical field. "We've begun the procedure. Everything is stable." Whitman stepped closer, peering over Elijah's shoulder. "I wasn't informed you'd be leading this case." Elijah felt a familiar tightening in his chest, not fear, but recognition. "You approved the schedule last week," he said evenly. "I flagged a concern in the imaging and recommended." Whitman cut him off with a raised hand. "I'll take over." The room froze. Elijah finally turned. "With respect, Dr. Whitman, we're already in. The patient's anatomy suggests—" "I said I'll take over." Whitman's tone hardened. "Step back." A nurse hesitated, eyes darting between them. The anesthesiologist shifted uncomfortably. No one spoke. Elijah removed his hands slowly, keeping them elevated as protocol demanded. "This approach could be dangerous," he said, still calm, though his pulse had quickened. "If we proceed without adjusting—" Whitman leaned in, his voice low. "You're overthinking it. And frankly, this isn't the time for experiments." Experiments. The word stung. Elijah had heard it before, when he questioned assumptions, when he challenged routines that didn't account for everybody, every variable. He swallowed his response. Arguing further in an open chest cavity would only escalate things. He stepped back. Whitman took his place, reclaiming the scalpel as if it had always belonged to him. The surgery resumed, but the rhythm was different now. Tighter, tenser. Elijah watched from the side, his jaw set, eyes scanning the monitors. The numbers were still stable, but something felt wrong. The calcification was denser than expected. He could see it. He knew it. "Pressure's dropping slightly," the anesthesiologist said. Whitman waved it off. Within range. Elijah clenched his fists. He wanted to speak, to insist, but the unspoken rule was clear. He had been removed. His judgment no longer mattered. Minutes later, a sharp alarm pierced the room. "Blood pressure falling," someone shouted. Whitman stiffened. "Increase fluids." But Elijah could already see it, the complication he had warned about unfolding exactly as he feared. Outside the operating room, the Holloway family sat in a private waiting area, hands clasped, eyes fixed on the closed doors. They had been told the surgery would take hours, that the surgeon was highly qualified, that everything would be done to ensure the best outcome. They trusted the white coats, the titles, the hospital's reputation. What they didn't know was that, minutes earlier, the surgeon who had noticed the hidden danger had been quietly pushed aside. And what no one in that waiting room yet realized was that the next demand for answers wouldn't come from a doctor, but from a family who sensed, deep in their bones, that something had gone terribly wrong. The corridor outside Operating Room 3 felt unnaturally quiet after the doors slammed shut behind them. The hum of hospital machinery, the distant beeping of monitors, the low murmur of nurses at the station, all of it blended into a dull background noise as Dr. Marcus Reed stood still, his hands clenched at his sides. He could still feel the phantom weight of surgical gloves on his fingers, the sudden interruption replaying in his mind again and again. Moments earlier, he had been leading a complex cardiovascular procedure, one he had performed dozens of times before with steady hands and unwavering focus. The patient, Eleanor Whitmore, lay on the table with her chest open, her life literally resting on the precision of every decision Marcus made. The room had been calm, controlled, professional, until it wasn't. "Step away from the table, doctor. Read." The voice had cut through the operating room like a blade. Dr. Howard Klein, the head of surgery, stood near the door, his expression stiff, his eyes avoiding Marcus's. Two administrators followed behind him, their presence entirely out of place in a sterile surgical environment. Marcus had frozen for half a second, certain he must have misheard. Surgeons were not removed mid-procedure unless something had gone catastrophically wrong. But nothing had. The patient was stable. The procedure was progressing exactly as planned. "What's the issue?" Marcus had asked calmly, even as his heart rate spiked. Dr. Klein hadn't answered directly. "We're making a change. Dr. Fallon will take over." No explanation, no discussion, just an order. Now in the hallway, Marcus exhaled slowly, forcing himself to stay composed. Years of training had taught him that emotion had no place in surgery, but this wasn't about medicine. This was something else entirely, and he felt it in his bones. A nurse he recognized, Clara Nguyen, approached cautiously. "Doctor? Reed, are you okay?" she asked in a low voice, glancing back toward the operating room doors. "I'm fine," Marcus replied, though his jaw was tight. "How's Mrs. Whitmore?" "She was stable when they took you out," Clara said, hesitation flickering across her face. "But I've never seen this happen before." "Neither have I," Marcus said quietly. Down the hall, raised voices suddenly echoed. Marcus turned just in time to see a tall man in an expensive coat stride toward the nurse's station, his face flushed with anger. A woman followed closely behind him, her eyes wide with fear. "That's my mother in there," the man shouted. Why was her surgeon removed? Marcus recognized them instantly. Thomas Whitmore and his wife, Lillian. He had met them just hours earlier, explained the risks, the procedure, the recovery. They had trusted him. Eleanor had trusted him. Hospital staff attempted to intercept them, offering vague reassurances, but Thomas wasn't having it. His eyes scanned the corridor until they landed on Marcus. "You," Thomas said sharply, pointing. "You were the surgeon. Why aren't you in there?" Before Marcus could respond, Dr. Klein stepped between them. "Sir, we're handling the situation internally. Your mother is receiving excellent care." "That doesn't answer my question," Thomas snapped. "Why was he removed?" Dr. Klein's lips pressed into a thin line. "There were concerns." "What concerns?" Lillian asked, her voice trembling. "He was confident. He explained everything. We trusted him." Marcus felt every eye shift toward him. This was the moment when explanations were supposed to come, when transparency mattered. Instead, Dr. Klein said, "This is not the appropriate place to discuss staff matters." Thomas stared at him in disbelief. "So you pull a surgeon out of my mother's chest and won't even tell us why?" Security had arrived now, standing just close enough to be threatening. Marcus took a step forward. "Mr. Whitmore," he said calmly. Your mother was stable when I left the operating room. I would never jeopardize her safety. Thomas studied him closely, searching his face. Then why were you removed? Marcus hesitated, not because he didn't have an answer, but because saying it aloud would make it real. I wasn't given a medical reason, he said carefully. The silence that followed was heavy, uncomfortable. Lillian's eyes flicked from Marcus to Dr. Klein, then back again. Are you saying this had nothing to do with her condition? Dr. Klein cleared his throat. We need to move this conversation elsewhere. No, Thomas said firmly. I want answers now. At that moment, an alarm sounded faintly from inside the operating room. Just one sharp tone, but enough to make every trained professional in the hallway tense. Clara rushed out, her face pale. There's a complication, she said. Blood pressure's dropping. Thomas's face drained of colour. Where is Doctor? Reed's supposed to be right now, he demanded. No one answered him, but everyone knew. Marcus felt a cold clarity settle over him. Whatever reason they had for removing him, it had not been about skill or experience or patient safety. And now, with a life hanging in the balance, that unspoken truth was becoming impossible to ignore. Inside the operating room, something was going wrong. And outside, the questions were only just beginning. The hallway outside Operating Room 7 felt colder than the rest of the hospital, as if the air itself had turned against him. Doctor. Marcus Allen stood with his back straight and his hands clasped loosely in front of him, the faint smell of antiseptic still clinging to his scrubs. Through the small reinforced window in the operating room door, he could see shadows moving, new hands where his should have been, unfamiliar shoulders bent over the open body of a patient he knew better than anyone else in that building. Minutes earlier, he had been leading the surgery with calm precision. Now he was reduced to waiting, listening, being judged without a voice. The charge nurse avoided his eyes as she passed. Two residents whispered near the supply cart, their words dissolving into silence when they noticed him looking. Marcus had learned that silence well over the years. It was the sound of assumptions being made, of conclusions drawn without evidence. Dr. Allen. He turned to see Dr. Howard Mills, the hospital's surgical director, walking toward him with tight lips and an expression that tried, and failed, to look neutral. They've taken over the procedure, Mills said, unnecessarily. Dr. Whitman is scrubbed in. Marcus nodded slowly. I know. Mills shifted his weight. This isn't personal. Marcus almost laughed, but the sound died before it reached his throat. It rarely is, he said quietly. Mills cleared his throat. The patient's family raised concerns. They said they weren't informed you would be the lead surgeon. I was assigned this case 3 weeks ago, Marcus replied. They signed the consent forms. My name is on every page. Yes, but... Mills lowered his voice. They requested someone else once they saw you. There it was, not said directly, never said out loud in clean words, but heavy in the air between them. And you removed me in the middle of surgery, Marcus said, his voice steady but cold. Without a performance issue, without a medical reason. Mills didn't answer. A set of double doors at the end of the corridor burst open. Voices echoed down the hall. Sharp, panicked, emotional. Marcus recognized the sound immediately. Grief, mixed with fear, the patient's family. A woman in her early 40s stormed forward, her eyes red, her hair half-pinned as if she had rushed straight from the waiting room. Behind her were 2 men, brothers perhaps, and an older woman clutching a rosary so tightly her knuckles were white. Where is he? The woman demanded. Where is the doctor who was operating on my husband? Mills stepped forward. Ma'am, please remain calm. The procedure is ongoing. That's not what I asked, she snapped. Her gaze moved past Mills and locked onto Marcus. You were the surgeon. Yes, Marcus said. I was. Her eyes narrowed, not with suspicion, but recognition. Then why were you removed? The hallway went silent. Mills opened his mouth, but the woman spoke first, her voice shaking with controlled fury. "Because someone decided he didn't look right to be saving my husband's life?" The words hit harder than any accusation Marcus had faced that day. "My husband trusted you," she continued. "I saw how you spoke to him before surgery. You explained things clearly, you didn't rush, you answered every question, and now suddenly you're gone?" Mills raised his hands. "Ma'am, this is a sensitive situation." "No," she interrupted. "What's sensitive is that my husband is on an operating table while hospital politics decide who's acceptable enough to touch him." The older woman stepped forward, her voice quiet but sharp. "My son asked for that doctor when he woke up this morning. He said, 'Mum, that man listens to me.'" Marcus felt something tighten in his chest. "I want him back in that room," the woman said, pointing at the OR doors. "Right now." A nurse hurried down the corridor, face pale. "Dr. Mills," she said urgently, "there's been a complication." Mills spun around. "What kind?" "The artery repair isn't holding," the nurse replied. "Dr. Whitman is requesting Dr. Allen's input, immediately." Every eye turned to Marcus. He didn't move right away, not out of pride, but out of principle. "You removed me," he said calmly. "You made it clear my presence was a problem." The woman stepped closer to him, her voice breaking. "Please," she said, "if you can help my husband, I don't care what anyone else thinks." For the first time that day, Mills looked uncertain. "Dr. Allen," he said, swallowing hard, "we need you." Marcus took a breath. Years of restraint, of swallowing anger, of proving himself twice over pressed against his ribs. Then he nodded once. "Scrub me in," he said. As the doors swung open and he stepped back toward the operating room, the weight in the hallway shifted. Not all at once, not magically, but enough. And somewhere deep inside Marcus knew, whatever happened next, the truth was no longer something they could quietly remove from the room. The operating room doors burst open with a force that made every head turn. The patient's family stood there, faces tight with fear and fury, flanked by a hospital administrator and two security officers who looked suddenly unsure of their authority. The mother's voice cut through the sterile air, shaking but powerful. She demanded to know why the surgeon who had been preparing her son for a life-saving procedure had been dragged out like a criminal minutes before the first incision. No one answered her at first. The white-coated doctors avoided her eyes, suddenly aware that silence was no longer protection. "Doctor." Marcus Hill stood just beyond the threshold, still in surgical scrubs, his hands clenched to stop them from trembling. He had been told to wait in a side room, told it was temporary, told it was procedure. But procedure had never felt so personal. He could hear his own heartbeat, loud in his ears, as the administrator stammered something about protocol concerns and complaints. The family didn't accept it. They had seen Marcus in pre-op, calm, precise, confident. They had trusted him with their son's life. And now, with the clock ticking and anesthesia already administered, they demanded the truth. The head of surgery finally spoke, his voice thin. He claimed there had been an anonymous report questioning Dr. Hill's qualifications. That was when the room shifted. The father laughed once, sharp and bitter, and asked how a surgeon with 2 decades of spotless practice, published research, and international recognition could suddenly be questioned minutes before surgery. The administrator paled. Records were pulled up on a nearby screen, faster now, urgently. Credentials, certifications, surgical outcomes, everything flawless. The accusation collapsed under its own weight. Then came the quietest, most devastating moment. The charge nurse, eyes wet, admitted the complaint had come from a junior doctor who felt uncomfortable taking instructions from Marcus. The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning no one needed explained. The family understood instantly. So did everyone else. What had been framed as caution was exposed as prejudice, and the cost of it, Precious minutes, a patient on the table, was unforgivable. The mother turned toward Marcus, her voice breaking as she asked him to save her son. There was no hesitation. The administrator ordered security to stand down, apologized in a rush of words that sounded empty even as they were spoken, and authorized Marcus to resume command of the surgery immediately. As he scrubbed back in, Marcus felt something settle inside him. Not peace, but resolve. He would not let their doubt define this moment. The surgery resumed under his steady leadership. Hours later, when the final sutures were placed and the monitors showed strong, stable signs, relief washed through the room. The patient would live. Outside, the family wept and hugged Marcus, thanking him not only for his skill but for his dignity under cruelty. News of the incident spread through the hospital by morning, and consequences followed. Formal investigations, suspensions, mandatory reviews. Marcus walked out of the hospital at dawn, exhausted but unbroken. He knew the fight wasn't over, that prejudice didn't vanish because truth appeared once. But this time it had been forced into the light, and this time it had lost.